This is Sam of Historian-splaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And this video is Red, White, and Royal Blue, a historian's analysis. Part 2, occasionally vulgar but genuine. The romance of Red, White, and Royal Blue. So for anyone who is not familiar, this podcast is mainly audio lectures on a wide range of history topics. I recently completed a series on the origins of the First World War, but recently I also started my first series of edited videos, which are analyzing in great depth the movie that came out last year and that has since become my favorite movie, which is Red, White, and Royal Blue, which is a gay romance on the international theme, as I call it. And I'll link in the description to the previous videos that I've posted so far in this series, an introduction called I Know I Owe You an Explanation, where I get into why I think this movie is so significant and is worth analyzing this way, and part 1 on the historical context, which explores how Alex and Henry and their fictitious story fit into the real history of the British monarchy, gay royalty, and also the American presidency, and this fraught relationship between America and Great Britain. But this will be about the romance of these two characters, their personalities, their behaviors, and how they end up attracted to each other and falling in love. In a way, this is sort of the whole movie, right? Because the movie is a romance, so in a sense, every scene, almost every moment, counts as part of this romance. And in fact, in this movie, there is not a single scene, except for one little scene of maybe less than a minute, in which neither of the two main characters is on screen. So it's really all about Alex and Henry. And I think that these characters are developed and brought to life in incredible, vivid detail and nuance, which may sound surprising, again, for what seems to be a sort of corny, cheesy rom-com, which, ostensibly is what this movie is. But I'm going to try to show that it's more than that. Again, it's like impossible to know where to start in analysis of this love story because it pervades the whole movie. But I would still, maybe as some way to grasp what I'm talking about, I'll point to a very brief scene of, again, less than 1 minute that takes place apparently in a cafe in Paris. It's the first point where we see these two characters together in Paris, in this place that is, almost a cliche of love and romance, and that also the character Henry cited as the place where he would like to live in his imaginary alternate life, where he could be free and could be a writer, an artist, the sort of person he wants to be. And we see these two men seated together at a cafe, clearly fascinated and infatuated with one another, clearly wanting to touch hands, which they resist doing because they're still in public. But you see the fidgeting, the slow reaching across the table. As I've said before, a lot of this movie really is driven by Alex's fascination with Henry, his desire to know, to understand Henry. And it begins with Alex saying, "I have a question I've been dying to ask you." And then even before we hear the question, Henry deflects with a joke. And Henry makes not only one but two sexually charged jokes in this little scene. So we sort of see where his mind is, right? But Alex is still trying to learn, trying to probe. And he asks Henry, "Do you have a last name?" Which can seem like an incredibly mundane, even superficial question, right? But even this turns out to be revealing in the way that Henry gives this very complex answer, in the commonalities that it reflects, the fact that we discover both of them have these complicated hyphenated last names. And little by little, we see this curiosity developing into familiarity and intimacy. And I can't play this whole scene. I'm going to refer back to it again several times. I'm afraid I can't play it because there's a song playing in the background, which actually is also intriguing and revealing. And it happens to be a French popular song from the 50s called Le Canal Saint-Martin by the singer Maria Remusat. And we hear the lyrics faintly in the background, and the lyrics of the song are very wistful, even sad. They're nostalgic, reminiscing about an affair that the speaker once had years before in Paris, specifically in the neighborhood of the Canal Saint-Martin on the right bank. They include the lines in French, Et puis toi, comme le fils d'un roi, marchez près de moi dans la brume. Or translated, and then you, like the son of a king, walked beside me in the mist. So another very subtly slipped in royal reference, even specifically to a love affair with a prince, although in this case it's just imagined that he's a prince. But this is another example that keeps coming up. The closer you look at this movie, the more there are these little allusions, these little references that go back over and over again to these repeating themes. And this scene, I would say, more or less begins what I consider the second act of the movie, where the two have now initiated a sexual affair with one another. That is a done deal. And now the question is whether they're going to acknowledge their love and emotional attachment, and whether they're going to create an actual lasting relationship. And that is the main tension that I'm going to try to talk about now in this video, this very personal drama, which really revolves most of all around their own internal feelings, right? Not the political situation around them, which comes back into the picture later towards the end, but these internal emotional and psychological obstacles, the denial, the fear, the insecurities that stand in the way of their relationship and that have to be overcome. So suppose we start first by talking about the two main characters, Henry and Alex, which I've said before are exceptionally complex characters. And that's partly because of the novel, which is exceptionally rich and detailed. But even the author of the novel, Casey McQuiston, has said that they learned things about these characters from the actor's interpretation of them. So they really come even more vividly to life, I think, in the movie. So firstly, to start with Alex, who is the character from whose perspective we see most of the story, who you could say, at least in some senses, is the protagonist. So what do we actually know about Alex? What can we piece together about him? Well, just as for his background, he's from Austin, Texas. He describes himself as coming from a working class family. We know that his father is Mexican American and Roman Catholic. He came over from Mexico to the United States with his family at the age of 12. And now at the time of the story, he is evidently a congressman. His mother, Ellen, is white American, also from Texas, went into politics apparently fairly early in her life, not long after Alex was born, and won her first local office at the age of 27. And then somehow, by some unknown path that we don't learn in the story, she somehow has become president, and evidently is still quite young. Must have had a meteoric rise to the White House, since Alex tells Henry at one point that he was, quote, an anonymous working class kid for most of his life. So that means that not a whole lot of time could have passed here. So Ellen is perhaps still in her 40s, maybe early 50s. And this puts Alex Claremont Diaz in an exceptional situation. Not only being a Latino in the first family, which has never actually happened, but also being the child of two parents holding high federal office, a president and a congressman. And the only even rough parallel to this that's ever happened would be the Clintons, who for a brief time, in just a few weeks at the beginning of 2001, were in the White House. Bill Clinton was still the president, and Hillary Clinton took office as a senator just before they then left the White House. And of course, their daughter Chelsea Clinton would be the only person who's ever been in any sort of situation at all comparable to what's going on here with Alex. And this situation with, a president and a congressman being married presents a lot of constitutional issues about separation of powers and conflicts of interest, but we won't worry about that. Putting all of that aside, this situation also creates an exceptional kind of pressure on Alex. He has an incredible legacy to live up to. Neither of his parents is just an ordinary private citizen. They're both high office holders. They're both power brokers. And also, he has certain advantages in his position that neither of his parents has. He's a native-born American, unlike his father. This has implications, including the fact that he's eligible to be president, where his father isn't. He's also a man, unlike his mother, and that might give him certain political advantages. So this whole situation creates enormous potential and opportunities for him, of the sort that very often famous kids from powerful families either rebel against or strive impossibly to live up to. And of course, as we can see, Alex is the striver type of child. He shows an enormous sense of responsibility. He feels tremendous pressure. He's in the shadow of his parents, and he wants to measure up to this exceptional opportunity that he's been given. And also along with that, he expresses tremendous insecurity and status anxiety, which comes out in some instances in the form of mocking and teasing towards Henry, calling him Your Majesty, and also being very defensive about his height. He has considerable vanity, including about his body. We see his athleticism and his constant exercise. It appears he has been some sort of athlete. In his office, we see a lacrosse stick against the wall, so maybe he played competitive lacrosse. He's evidently a good swimmer, as we see in the lake scene, and he happens to have that in common with the actor who plays him, Taylor Zakar Perez, who was himself a competitive swimmer in college. And we also see him continuing to exercise in some form while he's extremely busy campaigning in Texas. And this is sort of ironic because his mother, when she dispatched him to Texas, said, you're going to be working 18-hour days and eating fast food for every meal. And yet we see him continuing to exercise, and hence it's possible that he's actually managing to maintain his perfect body, which, for most people would be actually impossible in real life. And it's suggested, I think, that perhaps he's doing this for Henry's benefit. He's also vain about his clothing and style and personal appearance. He's very particular about his shoes, which we do not actually see on his feet that I can recall, but Henry does remark on them in the wedding scene when Alex complains, you have to wonder how many families you could feed with what this cake cost.
You gotta wonder how many families you could feed with what this cake costs.
Probably not as many as if we put your shoes on auction.
And Henry retorts, probably not as many as if we put your shoes on auction. And later in his bedroom in the White House, we actually see some of Alex's shoes sort of displayed in a closet. He's very particular about his fashion, his appearance, and yet at the same time, he expresses frustration. Despite his vanity and this great care put into his appearance, he still wants very much to be taken seriously as an intellect and a leader. And he expresses this most aggressively, of course, to Zara, the deputy chief of staff, to whom he insists that the staff must read his memo about Texas and that he really does want to help. And when Zara tries to assure him that he is genuinely helpful, in response he scoffs, yeah, for like photo ops and New Year's parties and stupid like that, but I can be doing so much more. Also, more indirectly to his mother, he insists that she should be building a grassroots movement and, quote, firing up the youth vote, perhaps here thinking of his own sense of being overlooked as a young person and a child of the president. And again, in the pillow talk after the intimate scene in Paris, when Henry asks him if he ever wishes to step away from politics, he says, quote, I wish I could help more. And all of this feeds in to an ambition, which is probably driven both by his own healthy ego and also by this sense of responsibility. And we can see on the dock in the lake in Texas, he very casually remarks about having more free time, quote, until it's my turn to run for office. So he sees this as almost foreordained, like his job for the family. And again, this is probably motivated by several forces, partly altruism, his desire to, quote, make a meaningful impact on people's lives, and also at the same time a kind of repressed vanity. He loves to be admired for his good looks, but also at the same time fears that that will limit what he can do and whether he will be taken seriously. And all of this, I think, comes into relief in his interactions with the reporter Miguel Ramos, which are very charged. So we can see in the first meeting in the coffee shop in Washington that Alex loves talking with Miguel. He likes being heard and taken seriously as an important source in the White House. And at the same time, he enjoys flirting with Miguel. But the interaction quickly sours and turns to discomfort when Miguel compliments his looks. And when he says, part of your charm is your eyelashes, Alex makes an extremely creeped out face and then begs off and makes his exit. So we can see he loves to be taken seriously, even if his looks and his attractiveness are part of it, as long as his looks do not distract from his ideas. And more specifically, you can see with Miguel, he likes the flirting as long as it is not too obvious that that is what is going on. And I think that this sheds light on Alex's interactions with Henry and his sort of struggle with his sexuality. So Alex's sexuality is pretty mysterious in the movie outside of brief references to his encounters with men. So he says to Nora that he is, quote, low-level into guys, whatever that means. And he makes reference to having 2 encounters, one in high school and one with Miguel. So what this means is that Miguel is the only known intimate partner that we know of for Alex before Henry. He's also the only other man who appears in the movie that we know he's attracted to. And in fact, he's the only other person that either main character in the movie is attracted to that we see on screen. And so it's not surprising that Miguel does have some similar qualities to Henry. His very attractive face, full lips, soft skin, great hair, his intelligence and wit, his ability to read between the lines, as well as to challenge and tease Alex. All of these things prefigure Alex's attraction to Henry. And aside from that, we just have to assume, it seems, that Alex has had some sort of history with women. That seems to be implied in the fact that he is ostensibly heterosexual prior to his relationship with Henry, and that he seems to be perfectly good at having sex, right? He seems to be a good sexual partner to Henry, so he must have some sexual experience, but we know nothing about it. We see no sign at any point of him having any interest in any women, including those who literally throw themselves at him at the New Year's Eve party at the White House. So this raises a question, I think, of the possibility that Alex has always been primarily attracted to men and didn't realize it or was in denial about it. And in this sense, Henry awakens not just a latent bisexuality, which is how Alex comes to identify himself, but even perhaps his primary sexual orientation, which is actually towards men more than to women. Okay, now, of course, as a lot of fans of the movie will know and are probably saying to themselves, Alex's most dramatic quality of character is his impetuousness. He's given to making impulsive decisions, and we see this right from the first lines of the movie when he tries to skip out on the Buckingham Palace wedding and go do touristy things in London instead. And then he continues to act this out, of course, at the wedding, grabbing a drink that's been poured for somebody else. And this, of course, escalates further as the wedding reception goes on, as we know. And then later, repeatedly seizing hold of supposed openings or opportunities that aren't really there, such as when he makes a bad joke and Zara proposes sarcastically maybe he could host the correspondence dinner next year.
You hear that, Zara? He's opening with a joke.
Maybe he can host the correspondence dinner next year.
I'd be down.
No.
Alex takes it seriously and says, I'd be down. So this is his habit and his personality, especially when under pressure. And this sometimes escalates then into major blunders, like, of course, revealing to the press that he wants the campaign to make a play to win Texas before any sort of official plan has been discussed. And this recklessness is motivated in large part by internal hidden doubt and anxiety. So he talks aggressively in order to cover over his own doubts and insecurities. And he admits this, of course, to Henry in their correspondence. Quote, "For all my big talk and certainty, I'm secretly afraid I'm going to let my mother down." And Henry describes this back to him as imposter syndrome. So his actions tend to follow a sort of escalating cycle of rash, impulsive acts, followed then by regret and a desire to fix the damage that he's done. And often this effort to fix leads to a sort of doubling down, parlaying his own self-created fiasco into a greater opportunity, which then ends in a further snowballing disaster or in unlikely success. So you can see really the main drivers of the plot of the movie as basically a series of mistakes that Alex makes and then endeavors to fix, leading to a greater mushrooming disaster or to an even bigger successful endeavor. So, for example, of course, the antagonism towards Henry, which leads to a disruption of the diplomatic negotiations between Britain and America. Secondly, his indiscretion towards Miguel, which leads him to reveal an unsanctioned desire to win Texas. Thirdly, his excessive anger towards Miguel, which arguably results in their own outing. So when he runs into Miguel in New York, he lashes out at him in a way that I would say is rather unfair and puts too much of the blame on Miguel, and arguably then turns Miguel against him and leads to the leak and being outed. And fourthly, in his relationship with Henry, his push towards a committed relationship, which then scares Henry off and which Alex then has to fix. So in each of these cases, the solution becomes bigger and more dramatic even than the problem. So as for the diplomatic fiasco, Alex has to fix it by returning to Britain and pretending to be Henry's friend, which then mushrooms into a love affair with Henry. His indiscretion towards Miguel, he has to fix by insisting on following through on the idea and actually implementing a Texas strategy, which incredibly ends up succeeding. Thirdly, his antagonism towards Miguel in New York, he has to fix through his poised, measured speech in which he publicly confirms the relationship with Henry. And fourthly, as for scaring Henry away, he has to fix this by again rushing back to London, storming the castle, and confronting Henry. So all of these sort of snowballing mishaps, I think, are foreshadowed and encapsulated in microcosm in the beginning of the film with the cake disaster, right? Alex makes the mistake, firstly, of touching Henry, which in itself is against protocol. You're not supposed to touch royalty. And then further, of course, smearing icing on him, which escalates the disaster further and involves a lot of sexual symbolism and subtext. And then rather than apologizing and stepping back and allowing others to fix the problem, which really, realistically, in Buckingham Palace, there would be staff all over the place who would swoop in a second to take that suit away and replace it and get everything cleaned up. Instead, Alex tries to fix it himself, right? And it's that insistence that only makes the problem 100 times worse and ends up with an international incident. So this, as I said, establishes this pattern of impulsive action followed by regret, followed by a desire to fix the problem. And it's interesting that both of Alex's parents clearly recognize this pattern. For example, after the cake disaster in the Oval Office, his mother, the president, captures this sense. When Alex apologizes, says, "I really am sorry," she responds, "I know you are. That's why I need you to fix it." This is the life they've been living. And then shortly after Alex goes to Britain and comes back, he tells his father that he watched his father's congressional committee hearing and he wanted his father to be more aggressive. You should be tougher on these agribusiness mofos, he says. So he doesn't understand his father's more cautious and diplomatic approach. And so the father retorts, "Maybe I can get you to push them into a cake for me." So to sum up, Alex is drawn to action, driven by a sense of urgency and of responsibility. He is not afraid of making mistakes in the moment. He desperately wants to feel useful and to be of service, and needs to measure up to what he believes his parents have accomplished. And I think you could say ultimately his great fear is of his gifts not being appreciated or going to waste. And in short, his great fear is of being useless. But also the most important aspect of Alex's personality is dynamic and comes out in the course of the movie, which is his capacity for growth and evolution. And although this is represented often in very subtle ways through the movie, we do see that he changes dramatically over the course of the story. And this is brought about most of all by his encounter with, his discovery of Henry. Henry challenges his ways of behaving and his self-image, while at the same time triggering his protective instinct and his desire to be of service. Okay, so now let's talk about our friend Henry, who I maintain is among the most, possibly the most complex characters I've ever seen in a movie. Who is Henry? And why are he and Alex drawn to one another? So his character is constructed very subtly, often through hints and clues. So we have to reconstruct From these pieces, these hints, what do we know about him and what sort of person is he? Well, just as for his background, he of course is a royal prince of Great Britain by virtue of being a grandson of the king. His mother is the king's elder daughter, and hence she is the king's heir presumptive. Henry is the princess's middle child, and this is probably a double-edged sword for Henry. He most likely comes with common middle child syndromes, the issues of being overshadowed, but at the same time, this is made up for by his good looks and charisma. He's popular with the public, and it may also provide Henry with a partial shield from the spotlight. He is not necessarily under the same sort of scrutiny as his elder brother, Philip. In the movie, we learn very little, almost nothing, about his mother. She started a climate nonprofit, but she's apparently absent from Henry's life as far as we can see, and Henry himself is apparently rather bitter about it. So in the garden scene, when Beatrice suggests asking their mother for help, Henry says, quote, "Last I heard from Mum, she was off saving elephants in Botswana. Perhaps I ought to grow some tusks." So he seems to feel neglected. As for his father, he was an actor, a movie star, and he died from cancer about 3 years before the beginning of the story. And Henry evidently still has unresolved grief from this loss. In the hospital scene, when he and Alex are in the closet, Henry complains that he had been, quote, paraded around and forced to do public appearances only a few months after his father's death. Furthermore, the hospital ward that the two of them are visiting is apparently a cancer ward, which suggests that Henry's motives for being there have to do with trying to resolve his own grief over the loss of his father to cancer. Later, when Alex and Henry are speaking in the hotel in New York, Alex asks, "Have you ever had your heart broken?" And he answers, "The day my father died." So this still seems to be a central moment in his emotional life. So one could ask, I would ask, why is the death of the father so impactful for Henry? Well, one thing that we can know from what we see in the movie is that Henry's father was the only non-royal person in his immediate family. He was the only one who had grown up outside the sort of royal cult. He was possibly the only one who didn't judge Henry for measuring up to the image and the duties of royalty, and perhaps didn't scorn him for being introverted or private, having a private emotional life. And there's the possibility, we don't know, but it's possible that, like the king, Henry's father might have also known and sensed that Henry was gay. So this is never said explicitly, but it seems that Arthur, his father, died just as Henry was coming of age, perhaps in his early or mid-20s, which might have been a natural time when Henry might have come out. And in that situation, we can speculate perhaps Arthur would have been his main supporter. In fact, might have been the only person in the family who would have unconditionally supported him if and when he came out. And yet Henry loses him just before this happens. So with the father deceased, it's evident that Henry is lacking a guardian or protector who understands him. When Henry runs away from Alex and we see him back in London, we see a montage of Henry sort of looking for comfort or companionship now that he's turned away from Alex. And there's this montage where we see him first with his dog, then with his sister Beatrice, and then after that playing the piano. And I think you can see this as a sort of series of partial substitutes, inadequate substitutes for the kind of protective companionship he needs, right? And I talked about this before in the introductory video. The dog David seems to kind of stand in that role where Henry really needs a human protector. Beatrice is certainly supportive and well-meaning, but I think in that scene reveals herself to be a bit useless.
Cheer up. At least you'll never be king.
And then there's the piano, which can be seen to represent art and literature, which Henry also turns to for comfort, but is not really enough. And I think the fact that Henry has turned to these sort of partial inadequate substitutes can help to account for why he still has not come out and seems to be stuck in a sort of suspended animation. And ultimately, Henry, I think, is trapped in this sort of suspended state where there's an unresolved tension between his public and private selves, right? Henry has this sort of split persona, a divide between Prince Henry, the public figure, and Henry Fox, the private individual. And those two don't necessarily have to be in conflict. But for Henry, they seem to be irreconcilable. And the prince is charismatic, poised, self-assured, even aloof from some points of view, whereas the private Henry is emotionally needy, suffers from doubts, and is deeply romantic and sentimental, and has these romantic urges that are unfulfilled. And he manages the tension between these two selves through humor and through careful deflection and carefully managed concealment and innuendo. And he's able to strike this balance because he is, after all, a great performer, which we see in his public appearances where he's very graceful. And it makes tremendous sense that Henry's father was an actor, because Henry himself is also an actor of a kind. He's always playing a character. He's also a great performer in other respects. You can see his self-command in how he plays music. He's clearly a great piano player. Also in the karaoke scene, which is another kind of double-edged sword, because we see he's not the best singer, right? And there's humor there in the fact that his singing voice is not so good. But nonetheless, he can pull off this performance out of sheer conviction and charisma. And in these ways, again, I would say Henry is very reminiscent of Princess Diana, who I argued in part 1 is really the major inspiration, I think, for the character of Henry. Diana was also a very talented performer, was always impeccable at acting the role of princess, not letting on how much her private life was actually filled with turmoil and conflict. And Diana was a great theatrical and musical talent, which people didn't realize. But Henry's karaoke scene can be seen as very reminiscent of Princess Diana's unannounced dance performance that she put on in the middle of a show at the Royal Opera House for Prince Charles's birthday in 1985, and which, raised a lot of eyebrows, that both that she had that kind of talent and that she was a royal going on stage and performing for the public. She was also a remarkably good piano player, but this was kept largely under wraps so as not to upstage her husband. But she also sometimes performed impromptu. For example, in Australia in 1988, when Diana and Charles were visiting a music school in Melbourne, Australia, and at the teacher's urging, she sat down at the piano and launched immediately into a Rachmaninoff concerto. So Diana was able to maintain this public persona much as Henry does. He uses his performing ability to maintain public favor and also to a great degree to conceal his private feelings. And even his sort of performance as a supercilious snob, which we see in the first act of the movie, serves to cover up his actual attraction to Alex. So in his affair with Alex, we start to learn some about Henry's sexual life. Now, what do we actually know about this? Perhaps most of all, this has to be carefully reconstructed from the small hints that we get. But it seems that his sexual life started in grade school, and he makes the remark when he's basically proposed having sex with Alex, he makes the remark, "I went to an English boarding school, dear," implying that he's long been initiated into gay sex and that he started learning this in boarding school. And as I mentioned in the last video, this alludes to a long-time open secret in Britain, where boys' boarding schools, it was just an open secret that sex goes on there, and they've been basically shielded by the wealth and status of these schools and their patrons. Now, it seems Henry's sexual life continued on after this, and when he and Alex are at the cafe in Paris, and this is the first dialogue we see in these sort of romantic scenes in Paris, Alex says he has a question to ask Henry, and Henry retorts jokingly, "What other famous boys have I shagged?" Which is so revealing in so many ways. It's a typical Henry deflection, right? He senses that a serious question is coming, and so he deflects with a joke. But this suggests that Henry has had a sexual life comprising secretive liaisons with other famous men who probably also, like him, are shielded in a sort of closed private realm by their wealth and status and also by NDAs. This is alluded to when he and Alex are shaking hands at Kensington Palace, where Alex confirms that they have both signed NDAs, and he sort of snottishly remarks, "My NDA is bigger than yours." So you can imagine a sort of closed, almost glass closet, one might say, of famous wealthy men who hook up with one another and share this interest in maintaining their secret sexual lives. And Henry has been traveling in that world. Presumably, Henry initially sees Alex as another one of these liaisons, and he resists considering the possibility of something more lasting with Alex.
We just have to keep it very casual, of course. I just can't afford for you to fall in love with me.
And we can see that there is a lack of a real romantic relationship in Henry's life. If we think back again to that question in New York where Alex asks, "Has your heart ever been broken?" And Henry says, "The day my dad died." And you might even notice before Henry answers, his eyes shift around a bit as if he's searching for a good answer. And when he responds and says, "The day my dad died," that might be truthful, but it is also at the same time another deflection, because this is clearly not what Alex meant. It's obvious that Alex was asking about his romantic life. So Henry's response implies that he has never been in love enough with any of these sexual partners in the first place in order for his heart to get broken. And that's how he's maintained some degree of emotional safety. And this theme develops more and more, of course, as the movie goes on, and also in the deleted scene by the campfire in Texas, where Henry describes himself as wearing a metaphorical shield of armor to protect his heart, which he still has never removed. And Alex then, of course, alludes back to that when he confronts Henry in Kensington Palace and says, "You can protect your heart here in your palace forever and nothing will happen to you." So one can ask, of course, why is it that Henry is so afraid of having his heart broken, that he avoids a deeper relationship? Well, the reasons for this are not totally clear, and again, the hints accumulate bit by bit over the course of the movie. Is he afraid that any relationship he has will be destroyed by the crown? This seems to be implied when Beatrice in the garden asks Henry why he broke things off with Alex, and she asks, "Did Grandpa find out?" So she seems to think that the crown will destroy his intimate relationship. Or perhaps is it that Henry fears that the other person will abandon him, as his father, in a sense, abandoned him by dying? Or perhaps is it Henry is afraid of being publicly exposed and having to come out? Is that what he's trying to avoid? Or perhaps most of all, I would say, is Henry afraid of becoming intimate with a partner because he's afraid that upon discovering his real nature, which is in fact naturally sensitive and codependent, much unlike his aloof, self-assured public image, he's afraid that the other person will run away or turn against him, and so he avoids forming those attachments. Well, it's hard, again, to pin down for certain. It may be all of these things in some sort of paradoxical combination. But it is clear that Henry, in fact, has a romantic sensibility, which he has hidden and that has gone unfulfilled. There is his attachment to Jane Austen, as we see, for one thing, through the portrait of Jane Austen that appears on his bedroom wall near his bed. There's also in the scene on the White House South grounds on New Year's Eve. Henry expresses his sort of hidden wish to be a normal person and to live in Paris and be a writer. And it's clear that Henry associates this imaginary life in Paris with love and romance, since he says, "I would certainly date more." And later, of course, Alex and Henry do meet up and have intimate encounters in Paris, this exact place that Henry imagines his alternate life in. But Henry associates at the same time romance and his romantic nature with tragedy. There's a sort of fatalistic, tragic sense. So when he's asked what is his favorite movie, his response is In the Mood for Love, which happens to be a Chinese film by the filmmaker Wong Kar-wai, made in 2000, which is a tragic romance known for its powerful mood of yearning and lost love. And furthermore, Henry says this as if it's just obvious. Of course, this would be my favorite movie. It so captures his own sensibility.
In the mood for love.
And perhaps he says it this way also as another deflection, a way of putting Alex off balance. And all of this sort of tension between romance and tragedy, is in keeping again with what Henry says in the park in Paris. So when Alex asks him if he can ever belong to someone else, his response is only momentarily. So again, this suggests that he does want that sort of attachment and belonging to a lover, but at the same time, he limits it and runs away from it. And what he gets in his life is only unsatisfying simulacra or substitutes. Now, this sort of life that we're seeing painted here for Henry, it's not a very pretty picture. And I would say it's also not entirely unique. These repeated short affairs and encounters as a sort of substitute for a deeper relationship, this is not uncommon, especially I would say among gay men. I can't speak for everyone else, but many gay men, both in and out of the closet, follow this sort of pattern. And they may be, in a sense, promiscuous in the sense of the encounters they have and how many partners they seek out. But that is not necessarily due to a lack of interest in romance, but more due to various obstacles, social, economic, psychological, political, that stand in the way of a more lasting committed relationship. And furthermore, among men of the privileged classes, historically, this sort of lifestyle can often be carried on with some degree of secrecy, and it can often combine or coincide with a great interest in romantic art and literature and in the classics, which often make reference to same-sex love and romance, to the point that you could say this even constitutes a kind of classic old-fashioned British personality type. And the examples include many poets and novelists and art collectors. And specifically, as I mentioned before, Henry reminds me a lot of A.E. Housman, the British classicist who was a great Latin scholar of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and also became popular among the public for his poetry, the main themes of which are love, longing, and heartbreak. And Housman was gay and in love with his Oxford classmate, Moses Jackson, which shows up all throughout his poetry, but he never gave away explicitly who this unattained love object was. And he was renowned as a translator of Latin, especially of Horace, and only began writing poetry at the age of 30. And his poems were first published in a book titled A Shropshire Lad, which was tremendously popular. It seems his life and his personality were very paradoxical. Love was a big theme of his life and his writing, even though he never had a steady lover, but he did sometimes make trips to Paris for trysts with men, including male prostitutes. And he wrote with great tenderness and wistfulness, even sentimentality. But in person, reportedly, he was very cold, impatient, and even contemptuous towards his own fans who would write to him or go to visit him at his house. And one fan who went and met him said, quote, "Far from believing that that man wrote A Shropshire Lad, I shouldn't have even thought him capable of reading it." So I can't necessarily explain this sort of paradox of a person like A.E. Housman, but the answer, I think, may lie in the fact that his meanings in his writings were so veiled and indirect, and he felt contempt for those who might enjoy his verse without fully understanding what he was talking about, and who might even be disgusted if they knew the full story behind his poetry. So in this way, praise could only play upon his sense of shame and his frustration at being misunderstood. And you can see a similar paradox, I think, with Henry, where he veils and hides so much of what he's really thinking and what he really means, at the same time that he's frustrated when he is not understood. And you see this captured beautifully, I think, when he's dropping every hint he can at Alex about his attraction to Alex. Alex is not getting it. And Henry just says, "You're as thick as it gets," and turns around and basically attacks him. Now, there's also the question of Henry's shame. And I think Henry does feel a degree of shame instilled, but firstly by his royal upbringing, where there was clearly disapproval of him being gay. But also it's important that the shame instilled in him was not just about being gay per se, but even more broadly, it was about having any inner emotional life at all. So again, in the hospital closet scene, Henry says that he was, quote, paraded around while he was still grieving for his father. And you can see this as sending the message that Henry was not allowed to have a private emotional life. And this was considered, in the king's words, selfish, right? And you could put his desire for privacy and his desire to mourn in private as another one of these selfish desires that he was taught to suppress. So we know that Henry, up until the time of the story, has remained closeted, ostensibly for the sake of duty and his role. He feels guilt and obligation also for the level of luxury that he lives in. So in the wedding scene, when they get to the receiving line, Henry remarks to Beatrice about the extravagance and the excess of this occasion. And he even says, quote, when the revolution happens, it will be because of this wedding. So there's shame at the privilege and the advantages that he has, which he is sort of bought at the price of being honest and open about his private life. And this combines then, I think, into a further level of shame at being in the closet. For instance, this comes out in the confrontation in Kensington Palace when Henry denies being, quote, a liar and a coward, even when Alex had never said those things in the first place. So you can see Henry here as projecting his own sense of shame onto Alex. So Henry is caught here between two forces, between shame at being in the closet and shame at wanting to come out of it and wanting to break his supposed duties and the royal image he's supposed to maintain. And hence Henry is caught in a sort of paralysis. And there are subtle early indications of his paralysis, such as freezing right after he kisses Alex for the first time. And then, of course, running away and cutting communication off with Alex. And when he finally is forced to talk to Alex again, he expresses shame. He says, my behavior was appalling. There's also Henry's then passivity in the scene where he and Alex are being dressed down by Zara in the hotel in New York. And Henry does not defend himself against Zara's anger or insults, except just to say, technically I'm the spare, right? I'm not really the heir to the throne, I'm just the spare. But he looks terribly ashamed the entire time, eyes downcast. So Henry clearly fears exposure, not so much necessarily of being gay, but even more so of being caught out as a fraud. And this fear, I think, is most dramatically alluded to in a literary reference when Alex and Henry are passing back and forth recommendations of that you must read this book or that book. And the one that Henry seems to emphasize and articulate the most clearly of all of them is The Picture of Dorian Gray.
The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Which is a short novel by the gay author Oscar Wilde, published in 1890. And this book was controversial and quickly became notorious for its sexual subtexts. It's the story of a young English man from a wealthy family who attracts attention from both sexes, who is boyishly handsome, youthful, and charming. And one of his admirers is an artist who paints a portrait of him, which turns out to have a magical power. So after this portrait is given to him, Dorian himself remains young and handsome indefinitely through the years, even as in his personality he becomes more cruel and selfish, while meanwhile the painting, hidden away in private, ages. So the aging process is sort of projected onto the painting. Over time, it deforms into a hideous, monstrous caricature of Dorian. And so Dorian's hiding away of the painting symbolizes his fear of the rot inside him being exposed. And I think this allusion points to Henry's sense of himself being a fraud or even a sort of monstrosity, which the outside world would revile and which hence has to be hidden away. And this is then illustrated later in the piano scene after Alex and Henry have been outed, and Henry says, "It feels like everyone hates me." And when Alex denies this and reassures him he's still beloved, Henry says, quote, "They love the idea of me. Now they are faced with the reality." So Henry is really racked with these different feelings of shame and fear. And he responds through strategies not only of hiding, but of protecting and shielding his own inner life. And this includes, on the surface level, use of formal clothing and of protocols. For instance, in the first sexual encounter which he and Alex have in Alex's bedroom, Henry apparently keeps all of his clothes on. Not even his bow tie has been undone. He's fully clothed in formal clothing. And this can seem strange, like, Alex, what's wrong? Why didn't you do something to reciprocate here? But most likely Henry didn't want that. He was not ready for the vulnerability, even of taking his clothes off, let alone having a sex act reciprocated on him. And this limits his vulnerability. He remains in control. And we do not see Henry undress at all, the tiniest bit, until the polo scene, when Alex has to practically tear his pants off of him. And as for his style of communication, he uses veiled allusions and intimations. I referred to this in the introductory video, the way his dog is named after David Bowie, but he keeps this quiet, sort of under wraps. He uses erudition and wit, and ultimately his greatest defense mechanism is deflections. So we see deflections again in that same phone conversation. So when Alex points out, well, if your dog's named after Bowie, why not call him Bowie? That would be more clear and straightforward. And Henry simply says that would be a bit on the nose. It's his way of sort of vaguely turning the question away. And there's a growing pattern through the movie where Alex probes and challenges, trying to learn more, to understand more about Henry, and Henry deflects. Sometimes with humor, sometimes with just a cryptic or cynical comment that obscures his real feelings. For instance, at the wedding, when Alex remarks on the cost of the cake. Well, Henry's already made the same observation. We saw that when he was talking to Beatrice. So Henry could have just agreed with Alex, or at least intimated that he felt similarly, but instead he deflects with a barb. Not as much as if we put your shoes on auction. Again, the question about, has your heart ever been broken? And he says, the day my dad died. Again, that's clearly not what Alex meant. It's a sort of subtle deflection. And perhaps the saddest and most stark example of this is in the garden when he's talking with Beatrice, and he's told her that he's broken things off with Alex. And Beatrice asks, do you love him? And he responds, what difference would it make if I did? Right? Again, not an answer to her question, but a cynical deflection. Similarly, on the dock back in Texas, the same sort of thing happens where Alex says, I've been thinking, and Henry probably senses right away that serious, heavy thoughts are coming, and so Henry immediately says, I seriously doubt that.
I've been thinking. I seriously doubt that. I seriously doubt that.
So again, a joke to deflect. And all of this leads into this really pivotal moment where it's clear Alex wants to say that he loves Henry, he wants to intensify this relationship, and the pressure becomes too much, the cord breaks, Henry runs away. And there is, as I mentioned before, the frustration, this sort of paradoxical frustration, much as Alex is paradoxical in that he wants to look beautiful and be admired, but also doesn't want his looks to distract from being taken seriously. Well, for Henry, there's a similar sort of paradoxical frustration at not being understood, at his true character, his true nature, his true desires being misunderstood. And I think ultimately, to sum up, it seems that his basic fear is of being taken advantage of by those who perceive his weakness and his vulnerability. He feels himself to be emotionally fragile, vulnerable, with unfulfilled needs. Hence he describes himself as a prince whose heart is outside his body, and so can be easily wounded, or can be easily manipulated or exploited. For example, he goes to the hospital, clearly in part as a way of dealing with his own grief, but he apparently avoids being seen publicly, and to have this sort of semi-private emotional process observed and exploited for publicity. So he tells Alex that he goes to the hospital every couple months, never with photographers though. And this fear is probably also a major force then in his sexual life. He avoids emotional attachments for fear of being taken advantage of for the sake of celebrity or money or access to power, hence the NDAs and the avoidance of emotional involvement. So finally, in sum, I think you could say that Alex's great fear is of being useless, whereas Henry's great fear is of being used. Now, let's talk about how these two characters relate to each other, and their attraction. So there are certain commonalities, too, between Alex and Henry that make it make sense that there would be some compatibility. There's the sense of humor, mutual teasing and innuendo, as illustrated in the interview, where they both sort of lob challenging jokes at one another, even if those jokes are not especially funny. Also, their humor can be dark. Each of them is capable of very dark imagination. Alex, when he's trying to get out of being sent to Great Britain, he threatens, well, what if I set myself on fire? Later, when Alex is in England and they go to the hospital, Henry declines Alex's invitation to the New Year's Eve party.
You're expected at my New Year's party.
No, I hate New Year's.
And when Alex says, well, most people would kill for an invite to my party, Henry retorts, in one of his few really witty lines, he retorts, that's perfect. They can kill me and then I don't have to go.
Wow. Most people would kill to get an invite to my party.
That's perfect. You can kill me and I won't have to go.
Each of them also has very exacting and precise taste in music and in clothing. Both of them are athletic. We see them connected to sports. In the case of Alex, lacrosse and swimming. And in the case of Henry, football, as it's properly called, or soccer, as Americans call it, and, of course, polo. Both of them, of course, carry burdens from their prominent families. And as we learn in the Paris cafe scene, both of these men have hyphenated last names, Hanover Stewart and Claremont Diaz, which can be seen to represent the legacies that both of them carry and feel that they have to live up to. They also share a sense of altruism and a certain earnestness. We see that with Henry visiting the hospital regularly, and with Alex wanting to enter into politics for at least purportedly idealistic reasons, making a difference to others. Both of them have anxieties about leading possibly meaningless lives of privilege and not being of service. And there are, of course, parallel lines where one character almost perfectly echoes the other. There is the case of the cake, which I mentioned before, where Henry observes the great expense, and then Alex points out the same thing. You could even perhaps see the cake-tastrophe as actually a sort of Freudian expression of their shared resentment and guilt over their privilege, which they lash out and take out on the cake. There's also this repeating line about the meaningful impact.
To know that what you do has a meaningful impact on people's lives.
Sometimes I wonder if what we do has any meaningful impact on people's lives.
So this is another instance again of Henry hiding just how much he actually agrees with Alex and shares the same feelings. Now, specifically, what appeals to Alex about Henry? Well, of course, there's his incredible good looks. Also, surely his intelligence, his poise, his talents, such as you see at the piano. You know, that's one of the points where Alex just beams adoringly at Henry when he's playing piano. His altruism and idealism, his hidden strength, which he makes reference to when talking with his father at the lake house. But most of all, I think it's Henry's vulnerability. Alex is attracted by the complexity of Henry's psyche and his emotional needs. And the first change where clearly Alex begins to shift how he sees Henry is in the hospital scene, where, for one thing, Henry acknowledges his grief and his lack of total self-command, so he's showing vulnerability. And later we see Alex watching Henry's private interactions with the patient, showing that he's coming to understand the very different private side of Henry. All of this, I think, appeals to Alex's protective instincts, and it appeals to his own sense of altruism, his desire to serve, and his need to be needed and appreciated. And one can see a dramatic shift as Alex learns about Henry, a shift from confrontational to increasingly protective poses towards Henry. Now, conversely, what appeals to Henry about Alex? Well, this is a bit less obvious for a number of reasons. We don't see as much from Henry's point of view, and Henry himself is more guarded about his feelings. But there are certain things, like Alex's assertiveness, which Henry admires, and Henry also has, to some degree, similar protective feelings. He perceives and responds to Alex's anxieties. So as I've mentioned before, in the hospital, he makes comments to allay Alex's status anxiety, and he also talks with Alex to distract him from his obvious fear when they're hiding in the closet. And then again on election night, he similarly uses distraction to keep Alex calm and reassured. But basically, Henry, it seems, is drawn to the same qualities in Alex that lead Alex to desire Henry. His idealism, his sense of duty, all of which we see illustrated in their conversation in bed in Paris. Also, Alex's openness and genuineness, which to a great degree actually set him apart from Henry. Right, so Henry senses himself to be a fraud, and he is drawn to what he sees as Alex's authenticity. And you can see a certain irony here when Alex writes to Henry admitting to Henry his anxieties about letting his mother down. Henry responds by sort of diagnosing him, saying, "I believe what you're describing is called imposter syndrome, but I know you are not an imposter." And so Henry perhaps is thinking of his own feelings here, where he senses himself to be a fraud, but he insists that Alex is not. And ultimately, I would sum all of this up as what attracts Henry is Alex's earnestness, which can describe basically a combination of altruism with slight naivete, which can lead a person to pursue what might seem to be impossible goals. And this is illustrated most of all, of course, by the Texas undertaking, where Alex chooses to take on a greater challenge than he has to or than anyone thinks he could or should. And you could see this as echoing once again the story of King David, or specifically David and Goliath. And as I said in the introductory video, there are all of these hints woven into the movie, drawing a parallel between Alex and the biblical David. So Alex is taking on this sort of David against Goliath role, and Henry clearly loves this, and he gushes over this more than anything else.
Dear Alex, I can't think of a single way to start this email except to say you're incredible.
And I think that the Texas undertaking suggests to Henry, perhaps unconsciously, that Alex is a person who is insane enough to try to take on a serious relationship with Henry, despite all of its great dangers and obstacles, and despite all the much easier pathways that Alex could choose instead. And I think that comes through in watching the movie. Although again, while it's subtle in the movie, it's made more explicit in the book. So in the book, there's a remarkable conversation that Alex has with a politician who's sort of his mentor. And this politician is trying to dissuade Alex from coming out and speaking about his relationship with Henry. And he tells Alex, you could just date and marry a nice woman. And because you're bisexual, you could do that and it wouldn't even be a lie. And Alex is infuriated and responds in Spanish, "Sería una mentira porque no sería él." It would be a lie because it would not be him. So that is, one of the great lines of the book, which didn't make it into the movie. But I think that psychological process is there in a subtle way, that Alex has this sort of unreasonable idealism and tenacity that he might commit himself to Henry despite the terrible complications that would bring up in his life. And Henry, you could say in a sense, is Texas. Appealing, promising, it speaks to Alex's emotions and his ambitions, but it is very fraught with enormous internal and external obstacles. And so winning Henry, a relationship with Henry, is in a sense like winning Texas. And hence then the double meaning of the ending line in the final scene of the movie where Alex says, "We won." This has at least a double meaning in the sense of winning the election and in establishing a relationship with Henry. And the reward that they seem to get for this victory is a domestic life together as represented by the house in Austen. Okay, I'd like to talk about the plot structure of the movie and how we see this relationship begin and develop in a remarkably, I would say, efficient way as it's represented in the movie. So the speed and pacing of this movie is, you could say, inexorable or even frenetic. It shows an immense evolution of this relationship between these two people, conveyed very tightly and efficiently. Now, many people have pointed out that the movie contains certain familiar romantic tropes. most of all, of course, enemies to lovers, right? And some people sort of start the movie and say, oh, this is an enemies to lovers story, like we've seen before. And that is true to a degree, but I would say not really. That's only one small part of it. Now, of course, the classic enemies to lovers story is Pride and Prejudice, the Jane Austen novel centering on a smart but naive young woman who meets a wealthy magnate, Mr. Darcy, finds him to be snobbish and aloof, fails to recognize that he's in love with her, and refuses his proposal of marriage, but then later realizes that she was wrong and that she's failed to understand his more subtle qualities of character. And clearly this was in Casey McQuiston's mind, and it's pretty clearly alluded to in the movie with the references to Jane Austen. But really, I would say this constitutes only one small part of the movie. And for one thing, this transition from enemies to lovers happens within about the first 45 minutes. That journey's already done when you're barely a third of the way through the movie. And there's far more going on. There are many more obstacles and problems that come up even after their love affair has begun. And furthermore, even if we just look at that first act where they go from enemies to lovers, it's much more complex than that because it involves first a transition from enemies to friends. And so this introduces more complexity and nuance into the relationship, and there's much more intimacy already there between them than you see in the normal rom-com, right, where rivals or enemies suddenly realize that they're hot for each other. So really, in the first act of the movie, they go from enemies to friends, and then friends to lovers. And some of you may know the great classic of friends to lovers is Emma, Jane Austen's fifth novel. So in this one, Emma and the neighbor, Mr. Knightley, engage in mutual teasing and rebukes, competitiveness, before they realize that they are perfectly matched and in love. And in many ways, the personalities of Emma and Mr. Knightley are very similar to Alex and Henry, respectively. And if we look at Emma, she is this larger-than-life personality full of ambition and delusions of grandeur, while meanwhile she's stuck in a small village with her father, to whom she's devoted. But she goes around this village trying to fix everybody's problems, and she ends up simply causing misunderstandings and disasters, which she then has to swoop in and clean up the mess that she herself has created. So she's a very great deal like Alex. Emma is also structured around repeating themes of misunderstanding, ambiguity, misidentification. There are hidden affairs, red herrings, fake relationships, misinterpreted signs, including an almost sort of similar trope to Picture of Dorian Gray. Emma paints a picture of a friend of hers, gives it to another male friend, and he treasures it. Emma assumes that means he's in love with the friend in the portrait, when in fact he's in love with Emma and he treasures the portrait because Emma painted it. So there are all these misinterpreted signs and symbols, and it climaxes with an attempted declaration of love, which Emma interrupts because she misunderstands and thinks that Mr. Knightley is about to declare that he's in love with some other woman and not her. So this can be seen to prefigure the disrupted declaration of love in the middle of Red, White, and Royal Blue. And similarly in the movie, we see enemies who have to pretend to be friends, but then become lovers and have to hide that as well until they are discovered. So it's, again, shot through with incidents of concealment, misrepresentation, misunderstanding, not only from the vantage point of outsiders, but also each other and even themselves, right? Both of these men keep misunderstanding their own feelings and their own motives. And I think the plot can be summed up basically as falling more or less into 3 acts. You could divide it up many different ways, but I think of it as more or less 3 acts. There's a first act which comprises the flirtation and the beginning of the affair. And here the main obstacle is Alex's denial, and the main question is whether Alex will acknowledge his physical attraction to Henry. Then there's a second act, which starts from their first trysts and encounters, maybe the polo scene, more or less. But in this second act, the two men have a sexual affair. The main obstacle now is Henry's denial, and the question is whether Henry will acknowledge his emotional attachment to Alex. And then after they are outed, you have a third act in which their relationship is suddenly made public. And the main question now is whether the outside world will accept their relationship. So I would say that there's more or less a sort of 3-act structure here where the conflict changes. But also, even before that, there is an implied prehistory of the relationship, even before the Buckingham Palace wedding that we see at the start of the movie. And this prehistory includes their first known meeting, which is repeatedly referred back to. And this supposedly was at the Melbourne Climate Conference first night party. And you can notice here, again, there's this reference to their shared interest in sort of altruism and altruistic causes. And reportedly, Alex introduces himself, but Henry is disdainful, turns away from him, and asks his equerry to, quote, get him out of there. And this little vignette, which we never see dramatized, it's only alluded to, this too encapsulates the ambiguity and the multiple shifting meanings of their relationship. So this little encounter is imputed to have at least 3 different meanings, or arguably even 4. So firstly, for Alex, initially, this exchange tells him Henry is a pretentious snob. But Henry in the hospital explains to Alex that in fact he felt exposed and exploited because he was still in mourning for his father. And so there's a second meaning here from Henry's perspective, that Henry is capable of feeling exposed and overwhelmed. And that's why he behaved this way. Later, in the bedroom in the White House, Alex asks Henry when he was first attracted to him.
Start to fancy you? Melbourne Climate Conference, first night party.
So now we're getting a third meaning to that encounter, which is that Henry was intensely attracted to Alex and needed to hide it. He couldn't show in this public social setting his desire to be close to and perhaps to flirt with Alex. Now, this explanation then confuses Alex.
I really thought you hated me.
I hated how good you looked.
Now, this can sound like a fairly normal comment, right? I hated how good you looked, in the sense that it was distracting. But here it again underscores the fact that Henry is compelled to hide his feelings and even to run away from his feelings, just as he does again at the New Year's Eve party and again and again. So, looking backward from those later incidents, one could even impute a further 4th meaning, that possibly Henry already was falling in love with Alex. And this, again, is made explicit in the book. That's what Henry says, that it was a sort of love at first sight. It's more implied here in the movie, but again, you can discern it here. In the movie, Henry's pattern clearly is that he is conscious of his physical attraction to Alex. That is never in doubt. He's aware of it and conscious of it right from the beginning. But he runs away, and also he maintains this denial that he is drawn to Alex not only physically or sexually, but he's drawn to him as a person. So this is where a lot of the tension is that mounts through the first and second acts. So in these early interactions in the first act, there's the initial antagonism, of course, the teasing and provocation about Henry's wealth and privilege. Henry dishes this back, pointing out Alex's insecurities. I know that you're wearing lifts, his vanity, and also arguably his sort of hyper-masculine American persona. But of course, there's a clear change through these interactions. First in Alex, when observing Henry in the hospital, and then from Henry as his attraction is increasingly revealed and expressed through his body language. So Henry might be able to conceal his feelings through deflections, but his body betrays him. And this comes out firstly in just the handshakes. So the handshakes between them are very erotically charged, especially for Henry. At Kensington Palace, Henry looks annoyed. That's his facial expression. But when he shakes hands with Alex, he grips the hand very closely and then has to tear himself away, as if he almost can't let go of Alex's hand. Then a bit later, as they're leaving the hospital, as other fans have pointed out, Henry has to wipe his hands off first before he shakes hands with Alex, since his palms apparently are sweating. Then he shakes his hand with a polite smile, but then in the middle of the handshake, Henry's facade breaks, and he looks at Alex again with a look of absolute burning desire. So the handshakes bring out a lot of this tension, but I would also argue that the most important handshake in the entire film is the one that doesn't happen. And that's in the scene at Buckingham Palace when Alex is in the receiving line and Henry very rudely snubs him and storms off into the ballroom. And I remember watching the movie many times and thinking, how could he do that and get away with it? That is so openly rude. That would be such an incident. Why does he do it? Well, it makes sense when you consider that this is not just a mark of Henry's snobbery or disdain or aloofness, but it's also a sign of his attraction to Alex. So his, negative talk about Alex, putting him down, treating him coldly, can be seen, as one viewer has pointed out, can be seen as a reaction formation, where if you are drawn to someone but you have to hide it, you can create this sort of habitual negative response. And as we learn, the handshake is erotic for Henry, to the point that it comes through in his eyes and in his demeanor. So if that's how he's feeling when he sees Alex in this receiving line, he snubs him and walks away without shaking his hand because he's afraid that he won't be able to hide his feelings. Now, this sort of struggle with Henry to firstly hide his attraction to Alex, then later keep it within private circles and maybe indulge in it, maybe feel out, probe whether Alex might feel the same way. This happens in their flirtation over texts and phone calls. And this whole sequence of interactions that we see between Alex and Henry starts off right from the beginning with sexual innuendo. Sort of sexual double entendres and references run through the whole conversation. So it starts off with Henry teasing Alex's public photos in which he's got his hand in his pocket, and he asks, "Are you having a wank?" A reference to masturbation. It continues all through the rest of their interactions, this constant, obvious sexual, not just subtext, but text. Now, more subtly, when Alex responds, he remarks on the moles on Henry's body. Now, this is not directly sexual, but it does show that Alex is closely observing Henry's body, which suggests at least an unconscious erotic interest in Henry. Then there are jokes about Alex getting Henry pregnant and about Alex sending Henry thongs in the mail. And then even when they insult each other, Henry calls Alex a bellend, which echoes Alex listing Henry in his phone as a dickhead. So, references to the male body. And all of this sort of mounting sexually charged flirtation is then also punctuated by moments of surprise and discovery, especially in the phone call scene where Alex acknowledges that Henry is very different in private from what he would have thought. So this then adds to a growing tension that will have to break, which is the question from Henry's perspective of how conscious is Alex of their flirting. And this, again, I think is not uncommon between gay men and their male friends and acquaintances who are ostensibly straight. Flirtation happens, and the gay friend or acquaintance or whatever has to ask himself, this guy must know what he's doing, right? He can't be so oblivious. And Henry, I think, becomes increasingly incredulous. Then he has to ask himself, if I cross a line and initiate something intimate or physical, how will Alex respond? Will he deny that we've been flirting all along? Will he make me look like a fool? And this, of course, finally culminates with the kiss. Now, after this, of course, we see that Alex is not totally unwelcoming to this sort of advance, and he returns it. And so the physical consummation of the relationship proceeds then gradually in steps, not all at once, but gradually, from kissing to oral sex to eventually penetrative sex. And it doesn't happen sort of abruptly and then is regretted afterwards, as happens, I think, in many other rom-coms, nor is it saved up till the end. It happens step by step, but it comes in early on in the relationship when they're still sort of testing the waters with one another. And I think this, too, is very realistic to gay liaisons. Often sex comes in early. It's part of how the two partners get familiar with each other and test out their compatibility. But this, again, does not mean that those gay men who conduct themselves this way are uninterested in love. It's more often thought this is part of how you look for a partner. And Alex, I think, quickly realizes that sex is the best way for him to get close to Henry. And so he embraces the idea of sexual closeness and intimacy, but in a general sort of non-specific way, right? And even when he's trying to sort of be assertive, like at the state dinner, he says, "I will do bad things to you." It's this very general sort of thing. And it seems that Alex is willing at first to push things forward in keeping with his impetuous personality, where he's always looking for the next action. And he tries out here a sort of commanding tone here in the state dinner, and then afterwards when Henry comes to his room. And there's this sort of strong hint of sadomasochism when he says, "You're late," and almost closes the door on Henry. And Henry seems to respond to this. It excites him. But also Henry immediately turns around and asserts himself towards Alex. He takes back the initiative, pushes Alex, and really takes control of the situation. All throughout this first act, as they're sort of testing each other and experimenting, there is a complex push and pull, which is illustrated with many reversals, where the same words or gestures that mean one thing in one context reappear later with changing or even opposite meanings, often hinting at their attraction and foreshadowing. These include their body language, for instance, the way they turn inward towards one another. So if you look at the cake scene where they're kind of at each other's throats, they knock over the cake. Well, when they're on the floor and the cake is starting to topple and it's bearing down upon them, instead of rolling away to get away from the cake, which would be the natural thing to do, instead they seem to instinctively turn inwards towards one another. And then later in the phone call scene, they're both lying in bed, much as they were on the floor in Buckingham Palace, and they turn inwards towards one another. Even though they're not even in the same room and can't see one another, the exact motion and position of their bodies echoes the cake scene. So as the affair escalates and intensifies, each of the two main characters drives it forward in very different ways. They have different ways of showing their attraction, and they want different things from one another. So Henry shows his attraction most of all, of course, through physical touch and sex. Henry is clearly confident in his body and in his sexual knowledge and experience, and sex with men is a terrain on which he is comfortable. And moreover, his greater experience with gay sex gives him some control in his encounters with Alex, which is reassuring to him. So the pattern is that Henry keeps escalating their physical encounters, initiating new, more intense, more intimate forms of touch, and Alex then reciprocates in kind, maybe right away or maybe a bit later. So just as for the first touch, the first time they touch each other is when Henry aggressively pokes Alex in the chest, confronting him about his rudeness. Alex then answers this by grabbing Henry on the shoulder, which then, of course, escalates things into the cake disaster. Later on New Year's Eve, the kissing begins. So Henry grabs and forcefully kisses Alex on the mouth. Then he disappears and runs away. But some weeks later, when he returns, Alex then returns the same gesture in the Red Room. Then, later that evening, their first oral sex. Henry initiates this in Alex's room after the state dinner. Alex, it seems, as far as we can tell, doesn't do anything in return on that night, but he does seem to reciprocate the same gesture back to Henry a bit later at the polo match. And then as for penetrative sex, this is first proposed by Henry in the hotel in Paris, right? And Alex seems a bit flummoxed, but he goes along with it. This is what happens. And Henry evidently plays the receptive role. And, again, if you know anything about gay sex, you can see how realistic the scene is, and you can tell quite clearly exactly what they're doing at every step throughout that scene. But Henry seems to play the receptive role. This raises the question then, if we follow through on the same pattern, does Alex at some point reciprocate in kind? Perhaps so. We don't know. We don't see clearly, but we do know that they do have sex again. For one thing, in the New York hotel, it's clearly implied, and then again later in Kensington Palace after the museum scene. Moreover, back in Paris, Alex did not simply assume which role he would play. Rather, he asked who's going to do what. So we know that the possibility of taking the other role has definitely at least entered his mind. So it stands to reason that perhaps that does happen. Perhaps the roles reverse and Alex returns the favor, so to speak. But regardless, either way, Henry is clearly confident in his physical engagements with Alex, and he likes to have some control in them. Henry is a person who has very little control over the course or circumstances of his life, and sex is a realm where, ironically, he can find some degree of control. And another way that's illustrated is in how forceful he often is with Alex. So in the Oval Office, after Alex returns from the cake disaster, he's defending himself, and he insists, quote, "Henry shoved me." And the president in return says, "That's an urge I currently share with the prince." And indeed, it is evident that Henry loves to shove Alex. And the fact that Alex is pretty big and tall and strong perhaps gives Henry some license to literally push him around, which apparently amuses Alex. Now, on the other side, Alex continually presses for emotional intimacy with Henry. So Alex, as we said, perceives that sex is a way to get closer to Henry. And what he's really after here is the intimacy. And he keeps repeatedly probing Henry, questioning him about his life, his experiences, his feelings. In the cafe in Paris, in the park afterwards, in the New York hotel, he's probing him with questions. As for physical touch, Alex sees and understands that this is a mode of intimacy that Henry is comfortable with, and again, he reciprocates what Henry gives to him. But he always returns the touch. He does not initiate. He responds in kind. Now, there are two possible exceptions that might come to mind. There's the Red Room, which I would say is the exception that proves the rule, right? He's responding in kind to what Henry already did to him. And he does it in part because he's physically attracted to Henry, but also, I think, because he's drawn to Henry's vulnerability. Right? Henry looks ashamed, he's apologizing preemptively, and so Alex moves in and aggressively kisses him as a way to reassure him and again get closer to Henry. The other big exception is the touching of hands. So Alex is obsessed with Henry's hands, and he repeatedly touches them, especially when he is trying to advance their relationship and deepen their emotional bond. We see this in the pillow talk on the couch in Alex's bedroom after their first sexual encounter. In the dock scene, he obviously wants to take Henry's hand when they're sitting in the cafe in Paris, and hence Alex is fidgeting and the two hands are sort of inching closer to each other without touching. Again, in the park in Paris, when Henry reveals the difficulty of his private life and Alex is moved and sympathetic, he clearly tries to take Henry's hands, but Henry pulls away, which is very upsetting to Alex. This desire then culminates after that in the sex scene in the hotel in Paris, where the hands become the main focus. Once it's been established what sort of sex they're having, then the camera actually focuses on the hands, especially Henry's left hand, which has his signet ring. And we see Alex taking Henry's hand, clasping their fingers together. This emphasizes the intimacy, the closeness, and it can also be taken to stand in for the sex act that we are not seeing on screen, right? They're clasped together until Henry literally begins to release Alex's hand, and then Alex follows. And this can be taken to symbolize the intensity and then the climax and release. The theme returns in the museum scene. And finally, in the climactic meeting with the king, finally Henry returns the gesture, taking Alex's hand. And then publicly their relationship is sort of officially confirmed when we see the two of them on stage with the president, and again Alex takes Henry's hand in view of the whole world. And there is, of course, here the great symbolism of the hand. Holding hands, of course, represents intimacy, partnership. It also is an allusion to marriage, right? To take someone's hand is a term for marriage. And there's this sort of looming question in the background throughout the movie of, are they going to end up getting married? And this is clearly there always in the background because the movie begins with a wedding. There are also, as I've said before, the many scenes of Alex simply observing, watching Henry, sometimes even from afar, watching him in the Buckingham Palace wedding scene as reflected in the mirror, through the doorway in the hospital, where arguably Alex for the first time observes Henry in a private space, a private interaction, observing him across the dance floor during the New Year's Eve party, and the sort of melodramatic scene during the song Get Low, where everyone is crouching, but we see Henry and Alex watching each other across the dance floor. This begins because Henry catches Alex watching him. Now, as I said, part of what is interesting about Alex is his dynamic evolution. So through the course of the relationship, Alex, for one thing, we can see him changing through his accommodation to Henry. He accepts the protocols. So early on, when he meets with Henry at Kensington Palace, he's told that he has to stand to Henry's right for photographs, and he's initially annoyed and resistant about this. But then a bit later at the hospital, he reluctantly complies. He remembers that that's the protocol, and he goes along with it. Subsequent to that, as some fans have pointed out very shrewdly, subsequent to that, in every single public appearance, Alex is always to Henry's right. Not only does he not have to be reminded, it seems to happen unconsciously, as if he's naturally internalized this rule and wants to adjust to Henry's needs. Alex uses the royal title mockingly, teasing Henry by calling him Your Majesty, which is the title for the king. But then later, when they're in the park in Paris, Alex very pointedly refers to the actual king as His Majesty.
And what about His Majesty, the king?
As if to show clearly that he is learning. There's also the matter of Alex admitting to being wrong. So when they're on the couch being interviewed, Henry jokingly says that Alex's best quality is his ability to admit when he's wrong. And then later, of course, when they're having sex in Paris, Alex says, I can't believe how wrong I was about you. Now, Alex, this is not a good moment. Save that for later. But nonetheless, it's very clearly shown that what Henry threw out as a joke or a barb has now come true. Its meaning has reversed. There's his demonstration, more importantly, of patience and understanding with Henry, such as following him on this sort of bizarre side trip to the museum in the middle of the night without knowing where they're going or why. Alex obsessively takes the initiative, but in his affair with Henry, he is rewarded for surrendering the initiative and letting Henry set the pace. He has to learn to go slowly and wait for Henry to let him in, first physically and then emotionally. And finally, this is articulated, of course, when Alex promises to be patient. And he even starts picking up the way Henry speaks about himself, as if he is accepting and internalizing the need to respect Henry's public image. In the speech that he gives, even when he's declaring his love for Henry, which is a very private, intimate feeling, he speaks of Henry using his full name and title, and he even says the name with the same little flourish that Henry uses when he tells Alex his name in Paris.
Prince Henry George, Edward James, Hanover Stuart Fox.
Henry George Edward James Hanover Stuart Fox.
So there's this dramatic accommodation to Henry, his needs, and his role as a prince. And along with this, we see a deeper and broader change in Alex's character as he becomes more considered, more deliberate, less rash and impulsive. The speech, of course, is very careful and measured. It affirms his commitment to Henry, honors Henry as a person and as a prince, but without revealing anything and maintaining their privacy. He does not lash out at Miguel or at the press. Miguel simply drops out of the story. In the meeting with the king, Alex speaks up for Henry, shows his protectiveness, challenges the king, but in a very measured way. And then he shuts up when it's clear that this intervention isn't going to help, and he steps aside and allows Henry to speak up for himself. So Alex really evolves the most dramatically And I think that's part of what makes him such a powerful character. But still, most of the inner drama of this relationship hinges on Henry, who is more afraid and more resistant than Alex. He's the one who has more obstacles to their relationship. And Henry evolves as well, in more subtle ways, but it is there. He too wants to accommodate Alex. When Alex tells Henry about why it's so important for him to be a political leader, to run for office, Henry says, "I'm learning." So there is also this desire to learn, to grow, but this is then dramatically disrupted in the dock scene, right? When Henry abruptly withdraws from Alex. So this is the first of the critical, pivotal scenes where the relationship is hanging by a thread and barely survives. And firstly, as for the lake scene, there is this lingering question that I've brought up again and again. Why? Why does Henry run away? He is apparently afraid that the relationship is doomed and that they're both going to get hurt. And as he tells Beatrice, he's afraid that he's getting too close to Alex. But we don't know clearly, why is the relationship doomed? What exactly is the problem? Is it that they will be found out by the crown and the relationship will be crushed? Will the palace somehow threaten or scare off Alex? Or threaten Henry? Will he be disowned? When Beatrice asks, did Grandpa find out? She's suggesting that the crown is the problem. But Henry's response, he says, not this time, which is incredibly ambiguous. What does that mean? Does it mean that this has happened in the past? That there are past liaisons that the crown has destroyed? Or is he talking about the future? That we haven't been found out this time, but inevitably at some point he will be found out. We don't know. And is that even the real problem in Henry's mind? Or is Henry afraid of something else entirely? Is he afraid that Alex will simply lose interest in him? Will he decide that he is not satisfied with this closeted secret relationship, that he's going to turn away if he doesn't get to have the public relationship with Henry that he wants, right? And that might make sense because in the dock scene, Henry first looks concerned and alarmed when he talks about openly walking through Austen holding hands. Or is Henry afraid that Alex cannot love the real Henry? Does he believe that Alex will turn away from him when he sees the real, the private, the emotional, the needy Henry, just as Henry thinks that the public will not love him? Does he think Alex is going to abandon him as his father did? So all of these seemed like possibilities as to why Henry runs away. But then further, when Alex chases after him and confronts him in Kensington Palace, another dimension comes in. Alex shows the intensity of his commitment, so then a different fear surfaces from Henry, a fear that in a relationship with Alex, he will still be controlled and scrutinized in the same way that he is as a royal. And he gives that dramatic line, "I will not trade one prison for another." So this fear was already to some degree hinted at in the New Year's Eve scene, where Henry says, "I want to be an anonymous person in the world." And then more so, but in an oblique way, it's also hinted at in the pillow talk in Paris, where Henry repeatedly probes Alex to see if Alex would consider giving up politics. Do you ever wish that you were away from it? And he's clearly hoping to some degree that Alex will turn away from public life and they can have privacy. And again, in the dock scene in Texas, Alex talks about running for office. Henry sort of, again, deflects, shrugs this off. Oh yeah, sure. So all of these are possibilities in the environment, right? Of what's going wrong here? Why is Henry so scared? Why does he hide from this deepening love affair with Alex? But there's also another reason, I think, as well, that I would throw in as to why Henry not only runs away, but also is repeatedly paralyzed and cannot resolve what he wants and what he doesn't, and draws out this state of uncertainty. And that's just that he's a masochist, right? Now, when I say this, that's a very charged term, right? And people might think of, kinky sadomasochism. And that's not what I'm talking about. I don't know. Who knows if Henry's into that or not? We don't know. But I'm talking more about a broader psychological masochism. And I remember reading somewhere, some literary critic, I can't find it, but some literary critic wrote that the poetic masochist is not the defeated party in a battle. Rather, he is the battlefield. And I think that that is illustrated here in Henry's psyche, that Henry seems to get a sort of pleasure not from the suffering of love and loss per se, but from the uncertainty and the inner conflict, right? He continually makes himself the battlefield between conflicting emotions, conflicting forces, and he draws these situations out for as long as possible before resolving them. And I think this comes into relief in the Kensington Palace confrontation, right? So in this scene, we see Henry's own psyche exposed more than at any other point. And we also see Alex's reactions in the moment, in which he has to shift from blustering to carefully measured and thoughtful reactions to what he's hearing from Henry. So this is a turning point both in understanding Henry and in Alex's evolution in response to his discovery of Henry. So Henry, for one thing, lashes out against the things that he thinks Alex is insinuating, namely that because he is trying to maintain his public image and hide his sexual life, that he is therefore a liar and a coward. Now, Alex, in response to this, does not double down, as he might have done. Had I been in Alex's position, I might have said, yeah, you are being a coward. Get over your fears. But Alex doesn't do that, nor does he deny Henry's feelings, but he says, quote, I would never call you a coward, right? And so here, Alex switches into trying to allay. He recognizes and tries to allay Henry's feelings of shame, rather than adding to or intensifying them. And secondly, Henry seems to believe that Alex does not recognize the gravity of his situation as a prince. And he insists to Alex, there are centuries of history bearing down on my shoulders, as if Alex doesn't understand what's at stake for Henry. And he accuses Alex of ignoring Henry's public role, saying, I wish you could see me for who I am and not who you wish for me to be. Right? The implication being that what I am is a prince, and you haven't reconciled with that. So this is why Alex's accommodations to Henry are so important. By this point, Alex has at least tried to reckon with Henry's situation, and he does not brush aside what Henry's saying, but tries to accommodate him. Now, as you know, Alex ultimately challenges Henry to throw him out of the palace, right? In effect, wagering that Henry can't do it because of his need for Alex. So he's forcing Henry to recognize his attachment to Alex. And he wins this wager, right? This gambit works. But why? Why does it work? Well, I think it actually works because of two very subtle things that Alex has said that send crucially important signals to Henry. So one of them is he says to Henry, we can find a way to love each other on our own terms. Now, this is unclear and ambiguous, but it seems to mean that Alex believes that the two of them can continue to carry on their relationship in secret and not have to be accountable to the crown or the press or whoever. This is important because it's obviously not what Alex wants. He wants a public relationship. And maybe it's not what Henry wants either. But Alex signals that he is willing to accept that, right? And this crucially addresses Henry's fear of being used as a prop, of being, quote, paraded around for the sake of publicity or status. Alex is signaling here to Henry that he doesn't need those things. He actually just wants Henry, the person himself. Then further, in refusing to leave, Alex insists that he will remain in the room as long as there is any hope of holding on to the happiness that I have found with you. Now, the crucial detail here, I think, is his use of the past tense, that I have found. This indicates Alex's willingness to maintain what they have already had. He wants this even if they do not take the further step of coming out. He wants to maintain the connection they already have, and this reaffirms that he desires Henry for who he is, and he desires intimacy with Henry, not simply his title or his persona or the prestige of being a prince's boyfriend. So this, I think, is the reason why Henry ultimately relents and doesn't send Alex away, but sort of continues, right? Extends the uncertainty, extends the irresolution by taking Alex to the museum. And this is obviously crucial too. Henry takes Alex to a place that Henry associates with art and history, which is very important to him, with his father, perhaps the most important person he's had in his life, and with his sexuality, right? This is the place of his pubescent sexual awakening. And further, the atmosphere of the museum is dark with soft light and soft focus. It's the most surreal scene in the whole movie. And I think that more or less we can say this sculpture gallery represents Henry's inner world, in which he has lived alone since the death of his father, but in which he is now bringing in Alex, the first person with whom he's going to share this inner life. And what is more, Alex seems to understand this. He listens, he follows, he indulges Henry, and when they dance, right, Alex, again, he takes the opportunity, right? You imagine dancing here, I'm going to play music, we're going to do it. And once they dance, this is the happiest that we see Alex in the entire movie. And I would say his smile here is the biggest, broadest smile we see from any character in the whole movie. Because I would say this is where Alex is getting exactly what he wanted all along, which is for Henry to let him inside. And further, there are these amazing parallels, I think, between the museum scene and the earlier scene in the Paris hotel, which is where Henry first allowed Alex inside him physically. Well, that's repeated here in the museum scene emotionally. So in the museum, we see Henry observing and admiring the sculpted male bodies around them, while Alex follows behind, observing Henry, observing them. Right, so this is in keeping with Alex's fascination, his desire to understand Henry. So in the museum, we are seeing Henry's admiration of the sort of idealized, sculpted image of the male form, and Alex is watching, and you could say maybe learning from Henry how to appreciate the male body. Well, in the Paris hotel, the two of them undress before they get into bed, and we see Henry observing and touching Alex's body, while Alex then observes Henry observing him. So Alex perhaps learns to accept himself. He gains greater confidence in himself, and he accepts his sexuality by observing Henry's own attraction to him. And all of this is ultimately consummated, I would say, not physically, but it is emotionally consummated in the way that Alex wanted in the museum. And all of this then comes into play later after the forced outing, when their relationship is again put to the test, this time by outside, external forces instead of internal ones. And the response, of course, is Alex's speech. So Alex's speech has certain political sentiments in it about queer liberation, which is all perfectly fine. Maybe we'll go back to that later. And it can be seen in part as sort of Alex's audition for a political office, right? He almost looks like a candidate. But the scene really works, I would say, as part of the love story. Because if you read between the lines, this is really Alex's message directed at Henry. So Alex makes this speech confirming the relationship without first consulting with Henry, which can be a bit shocking. It shocked me the first time I watched the movie. But when you think about it, it also makes sense, because Alex feels assured from what the two of them have already said to each other in the museum that Henry would want this, that he would not want Alex to hide what has been going on. And furthermore, the two of them are cut off out of communication. They can't get messages through to each other. So Alex, in a sense, has to make a public statement in order to reach Henry at all. If Alex didn't go out and publicly confirm the affair, then there would be weeks of continuing scandal and rumor and uncertainty, and Henry wouldn't know whether Alex was still committed to him. And he would very likely become afraid that Alex was abandoning, hiding, running away from the relationship, which would then only confirm Henry's worst fears. And so really Alex arguably had no choice. He had to go out and confirm this relationship. The question was simply how. And in brief, how does Alex do that? He confirms that they are together since the beginning of the year, which maybe he traces all the way back to New Year's Eve. And also, he insists that everybody should leave them alone and that they might tell more about their relationship when they are ready on their own timeline. So this whole speech has a double meaning and double resonance. It's all ostensibly directed towards the public and towards the press, but more fundamentally, it is also aimed straight at Henry. Alex is basically saying, I am still with you, I am not ashamed or embarrassed, but also, at the same time, your privacy, Henry, has been massively violated, and it is perfectly reasonable if you are upset. You can be angry about this, you can feel violated, but that doesn't mean that you have to be ashamed. In other words, Alex is saying, I'm perfectly happy to be out and open about our relationship, but it's okay if you were not ready or if you won't be ready for a long time. You are entitled to your timeline, and you don't have to be ashamed of that. Just as you don't have to be ashamed of being queer, likewise, you don't have to be ashamed of wanting your privacy.
This isn't about shame. This is about privacy.
So the whole message in this way is designed, even if unconsciously, to reassure Henry. And I think this is then confirmed afterwards when we see Alex in Zara's office. And after watching the speech, he says, quote, I hope Henry was watching. I could feel him watching. That is always what was really in Alex's mind. This, of course, then is followed by the Kensington Palace reunion, which is beautiful and perfect, no notes. I believe this is the real emotional climax of the movie. It's an incredibly efficiently designed and edited little scene. It is sappy in some ways. Some people feel it's sappy, like when Alex calls him baby. But I think it comes across well anyway, because Alex has been so serious in the speech that he has, in a sense, earned a bit of sappiness. And they then embrace on the stairs, of course, and this is where we see Henry's armor is finally completely down. Right? This is the real emotional fulfillment, I think. Henry's armor and defenses are totally down.
No, I'm not okay.
And he openly embraces not only Alex, but his emotional need for Alex. He's no longer resisting this. And the piano scene that follows is very rich and complex in references and symbolic allusions. But basically, Henry admits to his own sense of shame and fear. Alex tries to reassure him, but his fears cannot really be resolved without first confronting the king. So there's the confrontation in Buckingham Palace, where, as we saw, Alex speaks up for Henry. But after Alex gets shut down, Henry steps up for himself. And we see the sort of transformation of Henry, where he is now forthright about his love for Alex. He openly defies the idea that he should be ashamed or suffer any ill consequences for their relationship. And finally, the scene is concluded with a sort of public ex machina, right, where supportive crowds have gathered outside the palace. And this leads to a final resolution by Henry, which is also another reversal. You could see this as kind of the final reversal, where earlier in Kensington Palace, when he was angry with Alex, Henry had said, I wish you could see me for who I am and not who you want me to be, basically complaining that Alex didn't appreciate the difficulty of his situation. Well, now, looking out from the windows of Buckingham Palace and seeing the supportive crowd, he says the world will know me for who I am and not who you want me to be. So it's the same formula, but with the meaning reversed, right? Who I am, his real self, now is his private self, which has to be openly recognized and embraced, and I think ultimately reconciled with his public persona. And finally, the ending scenes in Austen give us another chance to see Henry's evolution. Henry has now confronted some of his fears, and he can now be a better supporting partner to Alex. So this is a nerve-wracking moment for Alex. The election hangs in the balance, and Alex has staked all of his work and reputation completely on this Texas gambit. And Henry tries to understand the stakes of what's going on and to be a calming, supportive presence. He takes Alex away from the commotion. He uses distraction. Alex is very distractible, so Henry knows that and uses that, distracting him, saying, look at my tie, this should give you good luck. And then after the victory, Henry indulges Alex's wishes, as Alex did his back in London. So he asks, what do we do now? And Alex takes them to the family house in Austen. And this is clearly parallel then to the museum scene, where we see the two of them sneaking away unprotected late at night on this clandestine adventure. In the first one, in the museum scene, we see Henry using his hidden key to get out of the palace gate to go to the museum. And then in the scene in Austen, they use Alex's hidden key to get into the house. And in a sense, there's a symbolic parallel where the museum scene represented Henry taking Alex into his inner world. Now we see Alex letting Henry into his inner world, which is represented by the house. And this inner world is one that they will now share in some form, whether they're at that house or somewhere else. And it echoes the physical intimacy, where Henry initiates and Alex responds in kind. Right? So now Alex is reciprocating, bringing Henry into his private world. And arguably, there's a sort of final lesson. Change, in a sense, begins at home. Alex cannot be a person fit to govern a country unless he can govern himself, right? Unless he can learn patience, self-control, and he cannot change the lives of millions of strangers all around him unless he can first improve the life of one person who is close to him. And that's why I think there's such a rich double meaning, at least double meaning, of that final declaration of victory, "We won," which Alex says to Henry and which Henry repeats back before they walk into the house. This refers to the victory of the election and the victory of establishing their relationship. It's a personal and political victory together. And at the ending, we then hear them enter into the house, but we do not follow them going into the house. They are at last given this sort of final moment of complete privacy, even from the camera and even from us in the audience. So those are my observations about the personalities and the love story that is at the core of Red, White, and Royal Blue. And as long and elaborate as all of that was, still there are symbols and motifs that I either didn't mention that some of you might be thinking of, or that I only briefly alluded to, like the keys and the glass closet, which necessarily has this kind of symbolic resonance to it. And so there are a lot of things like that that add a whole other level and dimension of meaning in this movie that I have put to the side and I'm saving till the next part in the series, which hopefully will be part 3 on the visual and symbolic language of Red, White, and Royal Blue. And this is where I hope to get into all kinds of symbolic images, the mirrors, colors, doorways, windows, animals, artworks that create this whole kind of symbolic world within the movie. I hope to get into that, and I think that will likely be the most fun part of this series. It's what I'm really looking forward to. So if you want to see that, then please help keep this podcast going. Become a patron at any level if you can. The link will be in the description. If you sign up there, you can watch this video on Patreon with no ads. And either way, please share, post, tell friends, enemies, frenemies, all of the above. And thank you so much for watching, and thank you again to my patrons, to everyone who's helped me to make this series, and to Marco Cera for letting me use his version of J.S. Bach's Schaffe können, sicher weiden. Thank you.